We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are honored to work and serve on this land. Reachability stands with the protesters across Canada, the United States, and across the globe, demanding an end to police brutality and racism. We acknowledge the deep and powerful challenges faced by the Black community in Nova Scotia, Canada, and beyond. Hi there, I'd like to welcome you to National Accessibility Week, our digital online conference that's going from May 31st until June 6th. As you know, we have some fantastic panel discussions happening, workshops, community-based, as well as really employment and employer-based. We hope that you can join us for more as we're moving through the week. You can go to reachability.org to register for anything that you haven't been able to get onto yet. And today we are looking at internet access as a legal right. Not too long ago, people across the world were introduced to the World Wide Web, opening pathways of knowledge and sharing via the internet. It didn't take long for people to join the technological highway, using it for a variety of things like work, education, and pleasure. As popularity grew, internet access became a service of luxury. But what does that mean for a large portion of our community when we wake up one morning in the midst of a worldwide pandemic? A time when internet access is vital for survival. The world around us is going virtual, and there are so many people without access to the internet and without access to tools and support to navigate services on the internet. The goal of our panel discussion today is to dig into what this looks like and to broach some potential ways to move forward to address these issues. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. We have with us today Sherry Costa. Sherry Costa has been a part of the disability community for more than 40 years and currently manages the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities. Hi, Sherry.
Hello.
And we also have Tammy Wohler.
Hello.
Hi. Tammy is managing lawyer of the Social Justice Office of Nova Scotia Legal Aid. In addition to helping clients with poverty law issues, the Social Justice Office provides outreach and public legal education. And we have Lucy Giebolt. Hi, Lucy.
Hello.
So Lucy is the Associate Professor of Law, Associate Dean, Graduate Studies, Associate Director, Law and Technology Institute at Dalhousie. That's kind of a big handle, so hopefully I got it all right there.
Yes.
The goal of Lucy's research is to explain, interpret, and evaluate legal rules, mostly in the area of copyright laws, and where possible, Lucy is making suggestions for improvements. So I just want to take a second to thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time. Before we jump right into the questions, I just want to let our viewers know that the panelists did decide that they'd like to take questions and answers as we're going. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have, and we will do our best to address them as we're moving along and hope to get to all of them. So we'll just jump right into the first question, and it's open to everybody, but I'll sort of direct things as we're going. So what does internet access as a legal right mean to you? Sherry, can we start with you?
Sure. Pardon me. Canada actually signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006, and the optional protocol was ratified by Canada in 2018. This means that Canadians have additional recourse to file a complaint to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities if they believe that their rights under the convention have been violated. Now, Article 9 of that convention is on accessibility, and Section 1 cites that to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, it states that parties shall take appropriate measures to ensure to persons with disabilities access on equal basis with others to the physical environment, to transportation, information, communications, which also includes information and communication technologies and systems, and to other facilities and services that are open and provided to the public. Section B of that also is specific to information, communication, and other services, which includes electronic services and emergency services. It also states that parties shall take appropriate measures to promote access for persons with disabilities to news, information, communities, technologies, and systems, including the internet, as well as to promote design, development, production, and distribution of these communications technology systems at an early stage so that these technologies can be accessible at a minimum cost. Furthermore, Article 21 of that convention also expresses the freedom of expression and opinion and access to information. So this states that parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that persons with disabilities can exercise the right to freedom of expression and opinion, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas on an equal basis with others and through all forms of communication of their choice defined in Article 2 of the Convention, including providing information intended for the general public to persons with disabilities in accessible formats and technologies appropriate to different kinds of disabilities in a timely manner and without additional cost. It goes on urging private entities that provide services to the general public, including through the internet, to provide information and services in accessible and usable formats for persons with disabilities, and encouraging the mass media, including providers of information through internet, to make their services accessible to persons with disabilities. Additionally, Nova Scotia enacted the accessibility legislation in April of 2017 and introduced Access by Design 2030 in 2018. And this document is actually a strategy and how the province is going to accomplish the work.
Okay. Thank you, Sherry. And Tammy, what does internet access as a legal right mean to you?
Well, just simply put, it means providing the infrastructure for the public, especially those in rural areas, to be able to access the internet. But as well, it also means providing the funds to support individuals and households in being able to access the internet. It's one thing to put up all the infrastructure you need in the various parts of Nova Scotia, but if you're a family who's low income, then you don't necessarily have access or the ability to afford the various devices that are necessary, whether it be a smartphone, tablet, computer, whatnot. So we also need to look at ensuring that families have access to that. Pre-COVID, before all that's happened and the world changed, the public, if they were lucky, were able to access the internet through their local library. So a lot of libraries have, they have a name for them, but the public access sites, where people can access internet, but that's limited times. It depends on the ability to get to the library at a particular sets of time and whatnot. And so I think COVID, this whole situation has really highlighted how necessary it is for families, individuals to have access to the internet through their own devices, through their own homes.
Excellent. Thanks, Tammy. And Lucy?
Well, both previous answers were very complete, but if I can summarize and add one element, is to me, making internet as a legal right means three elements. First, to be effective, well, you need the infrastructure, as Tammy just highlighted. But besides having cable or fiber optic or satellite in your area, you also need to have the devices to which you can connect. And both are very expensive in Canada. I think that the tariffs for internet connection are among the highest in Western countries, as far as I know. But the third one, and this is where I'd like to add to both answers so far, is that, well, you can access, but you also need to have a content that's accessible. And so if you're visually impaired, or if you have a hearing disability, you need to have adapted format to be able to read or to understand everything that you're accessing. So these are the three elements that you need to be able to effectively have access. And making this as a right, well, I think that we may discuss this, how we can achieve this. But I'd like to mention the fact that in May last year, in 2019, the Ministry of Industry, Science and Economic Development issued Canada's Digital Charter. And in there, the number one principle in the charter is universal access to the internet, that they promise being access to all Canadians. And in that principle, they do aim at the infrastructure and increasing skills and access to devices. They haven't mentioned the content, so the accessibility of the content.
Excellent. Okay, I appreciate your input there. Our next question is, I'm going to direct it to Tammy. Can you give us a specific example of where you have seen a need for that access to internet?
Well, in my day-to-day practice, what we try to do is increase access to justice, and access to internet does increase access to justice, but there's so much information online. It's access to information about your basic legal rights and obligations, about your legal recourses. In some instances, the actual applications and forms you need to pursue a legal right is online. But in my day-to-day practice, I see a real need for it. I've had different situations where I've had individuals who can't afford telephones, who are income assistance, but for some reason don't qualify for what we call special allowance, which allow them to get a telephone. And their only way to communicate with me would be via internet. And this is by going to the library. They have to leave their home. Sometimes they might have an old device and that they can take to the local Tim Hortons or a local hotel or somewhere where there's free Wi-Fi, and try to communicate with me then through that process. So, internet access has been so valuable for me to get instructions from clients, to share information with my clients, give advice to them, as well as the sharing of evidence. If I'm preparing for example, residential tenancies hearing, clients, might be taking pictures of their home, of repairs they need done, or text messages, what have you. The best way to get that to me and to the residential tenancy officers making a decision in their matter is through internet. We file everything electronically these days. So a client who does not have that access is really hampered in trying to make their case. Another issue we see even in the HRM, and I'm saying Halifax because we're a city, we have lots of amenities. But if you live in Spryfield and want to simply file a Form J, which is an application to the Director of Residential Tenancies because your landlord has violated your rights in some way, if you have a disability that impacts your mobility, then you might be able to get the Accessable, which is a great service, but it's not the most convenient service. It doesn't just pick you up when you want it to and just drop you off when you want you to and pick up again. There's wide windows for you to wait around. If we're able to manage on public transit, it can be a 2-hour bus ride one way to one of the 2 locations in HRM that accepts those applications. Because right now, it's when Lucy talked about content, that's something that I think is really important, is that you still have to file paperwork in person at Access Nova Scotia in order to make an application in the Residential Tenancies Act. So if you're someone who struggles with pain, if you have visual impairment, or something that is impacting your mobility, taking a 2-hour bus ride to Access Nova Scotia to wait for however long it takes to file your application, hopefully you have everything right there and correct the first time you do it, it's quite onerous. And so, my understanding is that regional tenancies is moving towards putting more online so that people can file their evidence online, file their applications online, which is going to be great for people who have access to internet, and will be great for people who have barriers to mobility and movement if they have that access to internet. And so that's where I see a real need for it, and that's where my day-to-day practice comes in quite frequently. I've also had situations where an individual has had a significant disability, such that they could not attend court. This was a number of years ago. Things are a little bit different today because of COVID, but back then it was agreed that he wouldn't attend the hearing. It was a trial that had a significant impact on his life. And if he had internet, and if the court was set up in a way that we could set him up through Zoom or some sort of visual media, then he would have been able to participate in the hearing in a much more meaningful way. The judge would have been able to see him, he would be able to see the judge and talk directly to his piece. And so I see so much that in my daily practice where it really benefits persons with disabilities. Visual impairment is something that I believe Lucy mentioned. A lot in the legal profession, a lot of documentation is still done. It's paperwork. We're killing trees a lot, quite frankly. With COVID, we're moving more to some degree to electronic forms. But if you have to serve an application on someone, typically it has to be a hard copy. And so quite recently, we've had an individual who, he received a hard copy, but he has some disabilities. His ability to read on top of that is somewhat compromised. And so it was very simple. We were able to email him a copy of the documents where he would have some program. I'm not sure the details of it, but we had a program that would be able to read it to him out loud, which would be easier for him to understand and to then respond to. So it just becomes so apparent, particularly in the face of COVID, about how important internet access is for my clients and for both my clients and unrepresented parties to obtain access to justice.
It's interesting that you touched on it the way that you did, Tammy. It's not just internet and access to internet. There are so many other branches that are involved in trying to help people get what they need from the community, and this is just one possibility of helping them to achieve that. And there is the ability to do that. We just need to figure out how to advocate a little stronger for this to be a service for everybody.
Yeah, I think we need to recognize that access to internet, it's not access to research. It's a way of accommodating persons with disabilities, and that's really, I think, how we need to start framing it. This is accommodation that is required to allow people with certain disabilities to participate in society, in various justice systems, banking. It runs the gamut. It's such a wide range.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that, Tammy. I'm going to move on to our next question, and I'm going to start with Sherry on this one. It's a two-part question. What are some common misconceptions people have about access and accessibility regarding internet usage?
Well, there's a misconception that everyone either has access to internet or they have internet, but this is false. And I know that my colleagues have mentioned a couple of situations here or scenarios where they do not. As an example, if someone is in rural parts of Nova Scotia, there are parts of this province that just do not have service providers delivering internet to those particular areas. In addition, if somebody who is low income or someone who perhaps is on the employment income support assistance, there you don't have access to internet. One of the reasons is that this is not considered to be an essential service. Mm-hmm. And in this new reality that we are all living in, the discouraging thing is, whereas we thought that the internet was going to be a great equalizer to be able to accommodate, in many ways it has become a gap that is showing disparity for those who do not have that communication. One of the most important things that we want to and we need during a period of this physical distancing and social isolation is updated information communications. And we are being driven by government, by services, by programs to go to the internet. and getting regular updates. If you do not have that device, if you do not have that service, you're not getting that information. And with that social distancing, you're not connecting in the same way to get the most current information for your needs. So not having access is actually creating an additional barrier.
Okay. And how can we combat some of these misconceptions?
I think we can educate people. I think what we should also do is have these kinds of conversations and make people aware of the necessity and also the need that there are those who do not have access to internet. And I think one of the things that we can do collectively is to start having a conversation about this being an essential service in much the same way a phone is. If you are in crisis, you need to have some way to connect with the outside world. This pandemic has shown us that the one reliable way for those who can do it, who have access, you can use either the phone or internet.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry. Tammy or Lucy, do you have anything else to add on ways that we might be able to combat these misconceptions?
Well, I just wanted to add that I think, quite frankly, this whole situation, the COVID world that we're living in, might in and of itself make people realize, oh, internet really is an essential service, that it's not a luxury so that I can watch YouTube videos or access online gaming or celebrity gossip. It really is an essential service that allows us to connect with each other, to access services, and to access information that's changing rapidly on an hour-to-hour basis at times.
Yeah.
There's a little to add, but I fully agree with Sherry that making internet an essential service would be a way forward. Just like decades and decades ago, the telephone was made an essential service and a public utility. I think that internet, we've reached a point where it's undeniable that the internet, in all facets of our daily life, from access to justice, to communicating with family and friends, to getting news, to doing almost everything, we need the internet nowadays. So to me, it's very clear that one path forward is to declare it an essential service.
And what's interesting about what Lucy just said is that the telephone is being replaced by internet, and not just in terms of communication, but if you have a device and do not have a telephone, you can use Wi-Fi if you have or internet access to essentially treat your device as a telephone. So it replaces it. It serves double duty.
Exactly.
And well, if the conversation continues, it's essential to have the infrastructure. It's essential to have the devices. It's essential to have the content. But and this is where the digital charter also highlights the the need to ensure that the people have the skills to use all that. So the one more step towards finding a solution, because you can equip a person with all those, but if you don't teach them how to use them, then they're not much further. And this is, no judgment call on this. If I look at my own mother, she has a very high-tech smartphone, but she doesn't use it as much as she could because she doesn't know how to. So skills development, and it's part of the charter and part of the principle on access to internet, that you develop skills among the population, and that you especially take care of the vulnerable people in the society to make sure that they do know, they have access and that they know how to use it.
Excellent. If it's okay, we'll move on to our next question. I appreciate that all of our questions kind of meld into the others, so we're sort of flowing nicely with answering them as we go. What is the greatest challenge to accessible internet right now? Lucy, can I ask you that first?
I think, well, beyond infrastructure, which is developing. I know there's some regions in the province and some regions in the broader country are not covered. So we need to make an effort to reach all the corners of Canada. But the costs, I think, is one of the major obstacles in getting everyone in society with the proper access to internet. And I don't know if Sherry and Tammy will agree with this, but if you look at Statistics Canada, you look the difference between the different quartiles of income, there is a stark difference between the highest income bracket. There 95% or 96% of the population do have access to internet in their own homes, but you drop to 90 some percent in the lowest bracket, which still leaves thousands of Canadians without access. And they need, like Tammy highlighted, they need to go elsewhere to have their connection. And in a pandemic, they don't have that connection because everything is closed. So we need to make sure that the costs are reasonable. And so I thought, if we push for having internet declared an essential service, like the telephone used to be, the telephone was declared an essential service and a utility, and that is now regulated. Not that the telephone is necessarily much, much cheaper, but there might be ways to control the costs of the telephone. Landlines are still much cheaper than the internet, for example. So we need to go that way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tammy.
So just a comment on the telephones as essential service. And so a lot of my clients are in receipt of assistance or benefits under the Employment Support and Income Assistance Act. If they have health issues, such that they need to book frequent appointments, need to be able to call 911 or seek outside help, then they may be eligible for a telephone allowance. But otherwise, unless you're eligible and granted that telephone allowance, you don't get a budget for a telephone. If you can squeeze it in, if you're lucky to have had a landline and been in the same place for a long time, not needing to rehook things up, that sort of thing, then yes, you'd have telephone. But yeah, even today in 2020, there are people who are without telephones because they can't afford them.
That's a big number of people without telephone. It's kind of scary to think we're talking about internet when a lot of people don't even have that basic service. So
no,
it seems we have a lot of work ahead of us to get where we need to be for supporting everybody. Sorry, Tammy, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just saying that, but with internet access, you can replace that telephone with the internet because
exactly.
It's a telephone. So I guess the way we need to push it is towards the internet access rather than the telephone.
Exactly. Excellent. Okay, so we've talked about the infrastructure and education and making things more of an essential service, making internet essential service. Those are all very important things. What are the most critical changes that we must make right now to face the future effectively in order to be able to change or advocate for change in these areas that you can think of? Can I start with you again, Lucy?
Well, I'd like input from my co-panelists on that. They're much closer to the field than I am. I mean, you can certainly have a legal recognition of the importance of having the service recognized as an essential service or as a right, etc. But then you also need to think of what does that mean in practice. Mm-hmm. And this is where either Sherry or Tammy might have a more practical view on things. To me, it's making it more affordable. and to provide the skills for everyone to be able to use the devices and the internet, etc. But I'd be curious to hear what what Tammy and Sherry can propose.
Sherry, do you have something to add?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we're looking at, I'm going to say, an increasing direction towards using the internet for services, particularly around this COVID new reality that we're living. And what I've seen, what we're all seeing, is that there's more of a direction towards providing education. You can set up an appointment with your doctor online. You can look for employment online. You can actually work remotely. Government services are moving more towards providing much of their services online and are directing individuals to go to specific websites for more information. And I'm glad that Lucy actually mentioned about that accessibility piece, because accessibility is not just being able to have it come to your house. Accessibility is if you are blind or low vision, you can access that content. The way that website and the information is presented is in plain language so that you can understand it. But I think first and foremost that we need to have, not only as was pointed out, the infrastructure, but it has to be affordable. It has to be fully accessible in every way with high speed internet, not a basic that you're struggling trying to get access to it. And again, I have to underscore, it has to be viewed and provided as an essential service, because it seems that that is the direction that society is taking, not only in this instance, but going forward. We need to look at how we can communicate effectively in the event that there is a second wave, but even recognizing that it's the new reality.
If I don't know if Tammy has something to add, but I just also came to me that well, the highest court in France has recognized in 2015 in a case involving a citizen in a tax dispute, has recognized that indeed the internet is an essential service. And internet, the right to internet connection has been recognized in certain countries in Europe, well, smaller countries, but still as a right. So I think Estonia and Finland and smaller countries in the south have recognized the internet connection as being not just an essential service, but as a right. So I think it's fundamental that we moved in this direction, and all the examples that Sherry and Tammy have given in daily life, it does show how important the internet is. And as just on that basis, there's a strong argument to be made that if for example, if the government sends you to a website to file your tax return or to benefit from any measure that the government puts in place, if there's no other way to access that benefit, that makes the internet a right? So it should be recognized and it should be implemented in practice as well.
Yeah, so I think, so we need more funding, we push for the funding for everything that my colleagues have spoken about. I think there needs to be the political will, and I think post-COVID that we need to really push for that. And when we had the COVID highlighted so much how we need the internet as a right. I think one example that we haven't really touched on yet is how many students were sent home, no longer have access to devices and no longer have access to education that their classmates might have because they don't have the same devices. And so I think that's another way that this government and hopefully the courts as well, when needed, will recognize that internet access is something that is necessary and to participate in society today.
Excellent. I couldn't agree with you more. I know I'm supposed to say neutral in the conversation, but I feel like there's probably a lot of people who are on the same page and feel the same things that you're feeling right now. So I appreciate that we're having this conversation, and it's all super great information that you are providing for us today. I'd like to open the floor. This is a little bit different. I'm hoping that you may have some questions for each other. So I'd like to open the floor to that. Not sure, Sherry, did you have a question for your colleagues in the panel?
Well, we started off, and I had, pardon me, I had alluded, or actually I outlined some of what the UN Convention outlines in the treaty, as well as the optional protocol, which is specifically communication pieces. Accessibility by Design 2030, also developing standards around communications. I guess my question is, and this may be a matter of time, and I hope I'm not opening up a can of worms, or maybe I'm hoping I do open up a can of worms. With that in mind, my thoughts would be, this is probably more of a statement than a question, that if in Access by Design 2030, my thoughts would be that unless it is provided by that time, there could be legal standing to challenge that the internet is not being provided to certain individuals in an accessible format. Am I correct with that, or is that just a stretch? And that's for anybody anyone who would like to answer.
I think certainly it could form a basis for a challenge. Actually, we saw a decision come out just, I think it was this week or last week, in which a challenge was brought because the province wasn't fulfilling its own commitments in relation to environmental protections of endangered species. They had put in legislation, put in commitments, and they didn't meet those commitments. So certainly if legislation is put in place, commitments are made, then not followed through, then I think there might be something there, that there's a basis for a challenge there. As well, but even before that, I think for my clients in particular, if income assistance right now doesn't typically provide funding for internet, to purchase devices or to pay for, access to internet service provider, that's something that even now we could start looking at and challenging and fighting for on an individual basis, at least for persons who might need it because they have a particular disability or a particular situation in which that the internet access is more important perhaps than to what I would call, someone who just gets the basic income, basic allowances. So I'm not sure how clear that was, talking on the top of my head here. But essentially, my point is that even now, if someone were to come to me, walk into my office, depending on their fact situation, there are arguments to be made for funding for access to internet on a case-to-case basis.
Well, I agree. I agree on both fronts about the possible recourse to implement international obligation. Of course, if Canada signs this obligation and Nova Scotia in its own field of power, they're bound by it, and they should at some point make sure that it's implemented in practice. And on an individual level as well, I think. For government services, there was a case in 2012, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, the Jordan case, where a person who was visually impaired had sued the government because not all websites had been put up in accessible format. And arguing Section 15 of the Charter, the right to equality, saying that, well, the person deserved the same access as any other Canadian, and the person won in the Federal Court of Appeal. So the government had, as a result, to implement accessible formats for this person, which is very good. The case has been cited many times afterwards, not on the equality provision or discussion of the case, but mainly because the judge in that case had ordered for continuous monitoring by the judicial service to monitor the implementation of the accessibility format of the websites. And this monitoring by the courts of how a court order is being implemented has been many times after being referred to by the cases. So that's just an interesting fact to know. I also think that since the Canadian government has issued last year this digital charter with having principle number one, listing internet access, there should be, I know it's a non-binding instrument, but there's the political will there. It should be at all levels. And I think we should push on that front as well to make, to make this a reality. So,
I think what's happened over the past 2.5 months is I think that communication piece has really been reinforced with everyone, how critical that is. And I think it was just last year as well, Lucy, that Canada actually enacted the Barrier Free Canada legislation,
yes.
which means that we have as a country, in addition to international obligations to the UN, as a country we have obligations, and as a province we have obligations to be accessible. And I don't think that we fully understand that accessibility does extrapolate out beyond the physical environment to the communications that we all need.
Yes, well, indeed, because in the Accessibility Act, at least the federal one, I haven't looked at the provincial one, but in the federal one of the top accessibility areas is indeed, as you mentioned, flowing from the UN Convention, is communication and information. And it's not further defined in the Act, but it should be, or at least measures should be taken to indeed implement that obligation under the Act, and not just leave it as a dead letter in the Act. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, since we brought up the Act, we do also have another panel talk coming up on Wednesday, June the 3rd at 10 a.m. And it is Inclusion in Act, the Accessible Canada Act, and what you need to know. So for those people who aren't familiar with what it's talking about and sort of the steps moving forward, that's available for people to register on the website as well. So that kind of ties in very nicely with what we're talking about here. And I appreciate that you've all brought that up and are willing to hash that out a little bit. Lucy, do you have a question for the other panelists?
Well, yes, I think I was curious to hear from both my co-panelists how they would see a practical implementation. So what would be the first measure that they would see or likely see implemented as a practical measure of, access as a legal right? Because as I say, you can have a very theoretical right, but it needs to be tangible and noticeable in the daily lives of the people who should benefit from it. So how would that take form?
Quite frankly, I think it needs to take form, it has to be something very tangible. I would like to see devices being given to, in particular, low-income families, low-income households. It's one thing to ensure that we have the infrastructure needed, in rural areas. It can be in the middle of nowhere, but if the person who lives in that area can't afford the device or pay for the service, then it's moot, right?
Yeah.
So it has to be more than just infrastructure. It has to be either you're providing people with devices or providing people with the funds to pay for and maintain that device and that internet access. So I think it has to be very concrete.
Jerry, any thoughts?
Yes, I am in total agreement with Tammy with regard to that practical implementation of devices. And I think along with that, I think Lucy mentioned this earlier as well, is the proper training, how to use that device.
Yep.
And I think people often say, like when you're talking about a system or communication system, they go to, it's a laptop or it could be a computer, but it could be something as simple as a phone, or it could be a tablet.
Yep.
But training has to be provided to go along with that. And the supports have to be there so as that it can be maintained. So the cost to maintain it, we all have to have upgrades to the device. How often our computer is saying, need upgrades to the Windows and such. But just the ongoing learning curve that needs to be supported as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's all the same package, I would say. You need to have access to the device, to the knowledge to use the device, and to the knowledge that's beyond. Yes. But
Yeah,
then I think the bottom line is the money behind it.
yeah, and I think it's important that the individual can define for themselves what it is that they need to make that connection. Because if I only want a basic service that allow me to communicate with close friends and family and access the internet for the most current information, I don't need to have a state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line computer with all the bells and whistles, because in some instances it could be overwhelming. So I think we have to go back to the individual who can determine for themselves what their needs are and how those needs can best be fulfilled.
Yeah. I don't think we need to have fear that the government will be giving us high-end computers, all the bells and whistles. But
No,
yeah, but no,
certainly not.
keep it simple and user-friendly, and but it has to meet a certain minimum standard. I mean, technology changes so quickly that it needs to be. You can't just give someone a device and expect it to last, for the lifetime, for example. It can't just be a once in a lifetime kind of situation.
And I'm curious if here in Nova Scotia, and I know with my background, I don't believe this does exist, but with some of my background, I do understand that there are such a things as assistive devices programs. And in some provinces, they actually have libraries with assistive devices that you can sign out a device and use it. I don't know if that exists here or not, but that does sound like it's something that we could probably look at, something tangible.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, it sounds familiar, and I can't think of where I would have seen it. I would be keen to see it in the households, though, because the COVID situation has really highlighted that if you don't have one yourself, because a lot of students, for example, require a tablet for school purposes, and the school provides tablets on an as-needed basis. Or if a child who has a particular disability, in which using an iPad or tablet is necessary as opposed to writing out something by hand. Once they're no longer in school, and once the schools are shut down for a reason, the child no longer has access to that, or easy access to that. My hope is that the schools are providing support where they can. But again, I mean, that's a huge disadvantage. It really shows the difference between people of means and people with more limited means, right? There's a huge advantage in terms of just education levels.
Sherry, I just wanted to add on to what you were saying there about the assistive devices. It's interesting that you brought that up. I did receive an email just shortly before we started. The Tetra Society of North America and its volunteers have created this device that helps individuals with mobility limitations to help them independently operate computers. And the good thing about this, it's called the NetClay. And the good thing about it right now is they do have several devices available for free still. So it is an option for some people to reach out a little bit later and get some more information. I know it's Andrew Jensen. He's doing a talk a little later in the week. I think it's tomorrow at 7. And he'll have more information about just what you're talking about there, more devices that are available and how people can get into contact with either getting their own or being able to have a share program. I'm not sure if one exists either, but he would likely have a lot more information on stuff like that as well. And I say that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. and people can register to go to see that one too at our reachability.org/NA. So it's another option to learn some more about the devices available.
I found a page on the Canadian government website, the Accessible Technology Program is investing in hardware and software solutions that help Canadians with disabilities overcome barriers that come in the way of their full participation in the workplace. Apparently, this program was launched in 2017 with a $22.3 million package over 5 years. And there's a link for a form to apply for funding. So, so you need a machine to be able to apply for funding.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means in practice, and I don't know how far along they are, if they've allocated the monies or not. And but at least there is a program. I don't know how far $22 million brings the population who needs it, but well, that such programs would be helpful, I think, or are helpful. I don't know. Hopefully, this is being used. And I don't know if I can type the link in the chat box. I don't know. Sherry, are you familiar with it?
I am not familiar with it.
So, so here's the link. Can you see it?
I can.
Good.
Ah, the beauty of technology. Look what I did.
So
it's very ironic that we're having
Sorry.
this conversation and giving out more information about how to access more things via the internet.
Yes. So you can apply for it via the internet, so that you can have access to the internet.
Have access to the internet. Yes.
Yes.
It's a vicious snowball. And Lucy, you just showed us right there. I mean, we're talking about education piece about devices, but there are programs that do exist, but they're just not very well known to the public. And how do we get that information and these little pieces of help to people when the only way to do that is via internet and being able to spread that word. So it does create a bit of a challenge for everybody.
Yes. Well, hopefully organizations like Sherry's organization and others can help with that. I came across this one while researching the digital charter. And, this is, I think, although this was set up apparently before the charter was launched, 2 years before the charter was launched, but I would think that this also corresponds to the number one principle of making the internet accessible to everyone as the basic principle of the charter. So,
excellent.
Don't know if there are provincial equivalents to this one, but
I did have a quick question. I think it'll be quick for Sherry and Lucy. I had a question earlier, but we've already answered it. But at different times today, we've talked about the need for education, particularly surrounding, people are unsure about how to use their devices. And that's something I run into. My clients have to email me pictures from their phone, but they're not sure how to do it. And quite frankly, if it's the same as my phone, I can help, but otherwise I'm kind of stuck. And we put on presentations and sessions every year on public legal education. And I know Reachability, for example, also does form filling clinics. So I'm wondering, is there a need for, and it is a practical need for sessions on technology use, in a very basic way, internet access, how to use phones to kind of, that sort of kind of basic education that, can be provided through various services, I would think, or through libraries and whatnot.
I would be convinced that there would be a demand for such training from different members of the population. I don't know, Sherry, if you have anything to ask, but I mean, if you buy a phone, you'll get the very basic information from the person who sells you the phone, but it probably will tell you can download the manual from the internet, and then good luck. But otherwise, if public libraries or other organizations were able to offer such training, like community associations, or I know where I live in HRM, or more in the rural area, you need this type of organization that reaches a broad public, or low threshold of accessibility, low cost or free, and you could also have software or computer program students who might volunteer a few hours here and there to go explain things. That might be a good idea for all, for them, and certainly for the people learning.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, there is definitely a demand, but I'm going to say that it's going to depend on the technology that we're talking about. I do remember, we probably all remember years ago when they had the CAP site. So is that persons who could access the computers, internet, and also if you didn't have an understanding of computers, you could understand to get lessons on how to use it a little more. But I think technologies in and of themselves, particularly when we're talking about persons with disabilities, technologies are so broad in scope that it would have to be directed by the individual. And I think there would need to be a central place for the individual to go to in order to get the information that is needed specifically for them. And I'm thinking of different devices that are used for communication. I know we're specifically here talking about the internet, but for those who are nonverbal, there's a whole list of devices that all require training. And most times when people are talking about a communication system, the go-to that people understand is a computer system that has some type of software like JAWS to help them understand the text or to see the text. But a communication system can be as basic as a book with pictures in it. It could be as basic as a sheet of paper with what's called bliss symbols on it, included with somebody who speaks a different language or who uses signed language to communicate with the individual. So to get back to that question about education around technologies, absolutely. But it has to, I would think it would need to be a very diverse group that can come together as needed once the actual communication technologies have been defined to provide that education. Did I just confuse everything?
No. But I think, to me, if I summarize, to me, this is the so beyond the infrastructure and the device, you also have software that are tailored to the specific needs of the person using it, according to the disability. And I'm perhaps a little more familiar with visual impairment. So where you have the DAISY format, you have all types of software, which I, as a sighted person, don't know how to use them. So I would never be able to provide any kind of support to a person who wanted to use them. So you probably need some form of training in the general accessibility of internet services and perhaps government and banking services, but you also need that specialized training for that specialized software that really makes the connection with the individual who suffer or who has a disability.
Yes.
And I
that's
think
where yeah, exactly. You need specialized expertise to explain that.
And that kind of ties back into what was said earlier about, people that are living with disabilities having the opportunity to have those conversations and make it known what they need to be able to succeed and the training that they might need to be successful with those devices. And even if it's just the basics, how do I use a cell phone, or how do I use this technology or software to actually get what I need from this, as opposed to you have this disability, so this is what you need. It's that bringing, the playing field, equalizing it more and saying, tell us what we can do to help you, as opposed to here's what you need.
Yes.
Right.
That approach is very important.
Absolutely. For us, it's a person-centered approach. So it's the individual who defines what their needs are. And then we, as the experts in the field and whatever multidiscipline it is, we can say, oh, based on what you said to me or told us, here's what we have. And here's an expert on that who can provide the training for it.
Excellent. This is all very valuable. I again appreciate it. We're just about out of time, but I'd really like to quickly just ask the one last question, and that is, what is the number one way that we can make a substantial difference moving forward? As you know, just people in society, or people sitting here listening to this conversation. What do you think is the one thing that we could do to help move this forward? Tammy, can I start with you?
Well, given my role, what I would suggest that people reach out. Okay, people need to speak up and to kind of fight for it. If you're someone with a disability and you need something put in place to help you access internet, so you can do your banking, communicate with others, access services, what have you. And particularly if you're on income assistance or in the disability support program, then you need to ask for it, make that request, make it formal, put it in writing, and then if you're denied, appeal it, and come to us. Nova Scotia Legal Aid. We're here to help you fight for those kinds of things under the Employment Support and Income Assistance Act. So that's the first thing I would say, is that on an individual basis, you need to make the request, explain clearly why you need it, and fight for it and appeal for it. And we're certainly open and willing to talk to anyone who might be looking to do that.
Thank you, Tammy. And Sherry?
Well, to add what Tammy has just stated, I think one of the things that happens, particularly within the disability community, is that we get tired. We get tired of having to fight for everything and the supports that are needed. So I think the one thing that we can collectively do is we can contact our member of parliament. So we can have the conversation with them about the needs. We can also find somebody or an organization in the community who can advocate on our behalf and have those conversations with us and for us. And I think we can also, even around this table, we can push the CRTC to address the barriers that are created without internet access. And the CRTC, they're responsible for the overall, I'm going to say, the regulations around internet access.
Yeah.
And we can push them to acknowledge that this is an essential service. We could sign petitions, we could start a petition, we could find out if there are other groups who are trying to move this forward and join with them, because collectively our voices are much stronger than if we stand alone.
Thank you, Sherry. And Lucy?
There's little for me to add, because you have the individual side of Tammy and the collective side of Sherry. And indeed, the greatest changes in time and through the adoption of the charter and over time in granting, or accommodating different needs of different groups in society has been done through advocacy and through collective action. And so I fully agree with Sherry that we need to organize and we need to push and we need to keep the level of awareness among general society high, that people recognize, especially, with the vivid image that we've got now through the COVID, how urgent it is, and that we won't be satisfied until everyone gets proper access, effective access to the internet. And this needs to occur, I think, at the, collectively. It's a social decision. And this is what makes Canada different from other countries, that we are, solidaire with also the vulnerable groups in society. So we need to keep pushing.
Thank you so much, ladies. I'd like to continue the conversation for hours, but we are out of time. So I do want to, again, thank you and let you know that I do appreciate your time and all of your hard work, and thank our viewers for being here, and just keep up the great work. And all of their bios are on the schedule, so there's contact information there if you need to reach out to anybody, or if there's any questions, you can direct them to Reachability as well, and we can pass them forward. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm trying to leave.
You can just X out at the top of the screen if you need to.